Don't touch my son. Rebecca's voice cracked through the hospital hallway so sharply that even the nurse pushing a supply cart stopped moving. Every head turned toward us. I froze beside the row of gray plastic chairs outside pediatric intensive care, my hand still resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. My grandson looked up at me with red swollen eyes, his small fingers trembling around the sleeve of his hoodie, but before he could say a word, Rebecca stepped between us like I was some kind of threat. I said don't touch him, she repeated, lower this time, colder. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, filling the silence that followed. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a machine beeped steadily behind a closed door. Daniel stood near the vending machines across the hall, one hand buried in his jacket pocket. He looked exhausted, pale, but he didn't move toward me. He didn't tell his wife to calm down. He didn't say, Mom didn't do anything wrong. He just looked away. And somehow that hurt more than Rebecca's voice ever could. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside his mother. Grandma was just, enough, Rebecca snapped before he could finish. Her manicured hand tightened around his wrist. The movement wasn't violent, just possessive, like she was reminding everyone in that hallway who he belonged to. I slowly lowered my hand and stepped back. My shoes squeaked softly against the polished hospital floor. At 68 years old, I never imagined I would feel unwelcome near my own grandson. But over the past few years, that feeling had become strangely familiar. Small things at first. Missed birthday invitations. Last-minute cancellations before Thanksgiving dinners. Family photos posted online after I'd been told the gathering was just immediate family. Rebecca always had a reason. Always a soft smile ready to explain everything away. Daniel usually stayed quiet beside her, nodding like silence could keep the peace. I used to tell myself marriage changed people. I used to believe patience could fix distance. But standing in that hallway, under those harsh white lights, watching my grandson avoid eye contact because his mother was angry something inside me finally stopped making excuses. The automatic doors at the end of the corridor slid open, letting in a gust of cold November air from outside. A man in a dark coat walked past carrying wilted flowers. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying quietly behind a curtain. Hospitals have a way of making every emotion feel louder, while forcing everyone to whisper. Rebecca leaned down toward Ethan and brushed imaginary lint from his sleeve. You need rest, she said gently, her warm voice returning the second she looked at him. Too much excitement isn't good right now. Then she glanced at me. And the warmth disappeared again. Maybe you should head home, Helen. Home. The word landed strangely. George used to say home wasn't a place. It was the people who waited for you there. But George had been gone for almost 3 years now, and ever since his funeral, I'd felt less and less like anyone was waiting for me anymore. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Mom, maybe we should just give Ethan some quiet tonight. Quiet tonight. As if I had been causing a scene instead of simply comforting a scared 12-year-old boy sitting outside intensive care after collapsing during basketball practice. I nodded once. Calmly. Dignity was sometimes the only thing left to hold on to. Of course, I said softly. Ethan looked up then, guilt flashing across his face. Grandma. Before he could finish, a door opened behind us. A doctor in blue scrubs stepped into the hallway holding a tablet against his chest. He looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitmore? He asked. Rebecca immediately straightened. I'm his mother, she said quickly. But the doctor barely glanced at her. His eyes stayed on mine. Mrs. Whitmore, he repeated carefully. I need to speak with you privately. The hallway went completely still. Rebecca's expression tightened so quickly that for a moment I thought she might argue with the doctor right there in the hallway, but instead she folded her arms across her chest and forced a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Is there a problem? She asked. The doctor hesitated briefly, the kind of hesitation people use when they already understand tension exists inside a family but do not want to step into it. I only need a few minutes with Mrs. Whitmore, he said calmly. Daniel finally looked up from the floor. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Mom, maybe you should hear what he has to say. I nodded once and followed the doctor down the corridor. My heartbeat felt strangely loud in the quiet. We passed rows of closed patient rooms, dim lights glowing behind narrow windows. Somewhere nearby, An elderly man coughed weakly. A television mounted in the corner played a late-night weather report with the volume muted. Outside the hospital windows, rain streaked softly across the parking garage lights. The doctor led me into a small consultation room with pale green walls and a single coffee machine humming quietly in the corner. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee grounds. He closed the door gently behind us and motioned for me to sit down. I folded my hands carefully in my lap to stop them from trembling. "First," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me, "your grandson is stable. His condition looks more serious than it is. We are monitoring him overnight, but the prognosis is positive." I exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment how tightly I had been holding my breath since arriving at the hospital. "Thank you," I whispered. He gave me a sympathetic nod before opening the tablet in front of him. "There is another matter I need to clarify." His tone shifted slightly, more formal now. When Ethan was admitted, there was some confusion regarding emergency authorization and medical contacts. I frowned faintly. "I do not understand." The doctor adjusted his glasses. "Your late husband filed supplemental medical directives several years ago through the family attorney. Your name appears as an active secondary guardian contact under specific circumstances." For a second I simply stared at him. George had always handled paperwork quietly. Insurance, investments, trusts. He used to joke that organizing documents was his version of gardening. "There must be some mistake," I said softly. "Daniel is Ethan's father." "Yes," the doctor replied carefully. "But according to the documents we received tonight, your husband requested that if emotional conflict affected medical decision-making, you were to be contacted directly." Emotional conflict. The word sat heavily between us. I immediately thought of Rebecca standing in that hallway, speaking to me like I was a stranger trying to approach someone else's child. The doctor studied my expression for a moment before continuing. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am not asking you to make decisions tonight. I simply needed to verify your identity, because your name was specifically flagged in the file." I looked down at my wedding ring. I still wore it every day even after 3 years without George. The gold band had become thinner with time, the edges softened from decades of wear. George always noticed things before anyone else did. Quiet things. The way people smiled differently when they wanted something. The way silence inside a family could spread slowly until nobody remembered when it started. A memory surfaced suddenly. 2 winters before he passed, we had been sitting together in the kitchen during a snowstorm while he reviewed papers at the dining table. I remembered him glancing toward the living room after Daniel and Rebecca left that evening. "If something ever feels wrong," he told me quietly, "promise me you will not ignore it just to keep peace." At the time I laughed softly and told him he worried too much. Now, sitting inside that cold hospital room, I realized he had not been worrying. He had been preparing. The doctor slid a paper cup of water toward me across the table. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. I nodded, although I was not entirely sure that I was. Outside the consultation room, I could still picture Rebecca waiting in the hallway, probably irritated that I had not already left. But for the first time in years I no longer felt invisible. And somehow that frightened me almost as much as it relieved me. I stayed in the consultation room for another few minutes after the doctor left, staring at the paper cup of water in front of me while the coffee machine hummed softly against the wall. My reflection in the dark window looked older than I remembered. The overhead lighting inside. Hospitals always seem to erase softness from people's faces. Every line looked sharper. Every silence heavier. I finally stood and walked back into the hallway, smoothing the sleeves of my coat like that small gesture could somehow steady me. Rebecca was scrolling through her phone near the nurse's station when she saw me return. She immediately slipped the phone into her purse. Daniel remained in the same chair near the vending machines, elbows resting on his knees, exhaustion pulling his shoulders forward. Ethan was no longer there. "Where is he?" I asked quietly. Rebecca answered before Daniel could speak. "He fell asleep." Her tone carried that same controlled politeness people use when speaking to someone they have already decided does not belong. "The nurses moved him upstairs for observation." I nodded slowly. "I would like to see him." Rebecca's expression barely changed, but I noticed her jaw tighten for half a second. Tiny things reveal people when you know where to look. George used to say that. It is late, she replied smoothly. He needs rest. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. Maybe tomorrow, Mom. Tomorrow. Another polite delay. Another invisible wall built carefully enough that nobody else would notice it. I could feel the weight of the doctor's words sitting quietly in my chest. Supplemental medical directives. Emotional conflict. George had seen something long before I did. I looked down the hallway toward the elevators. Nurses moved in and out of patient rooms under the soft glow of ceiling lights. A janitor pushed a mop bucket slowly across the polished floor. Somewhere overhead, an announcement echoed through the speakers asking for a physician in radiology. Life inside the hospital continued normally, while my entire understanding of the last 3 years quietly shifted beneath me. I brought Ethan his favorite sweatshirt, I said softly, holding up the folded navy hoodie I had carried with me since leaving home earlier that evening. He gets cold in hospitals. Rebecca hesitated before taking it from my hands. I will give it to him. I almost told her Ethan preferred when I tucked blankets around his feet because he hated cold air. Near his ankles. I almost reminded her that I had stayed awake beside Daniel during every childhood fever, every broken bone, every nightmare after thunderstorms. But experience had taught me something painful over the years. People determined to erase your place inside a family rarely stop because you remind them of history. So I simply nodded. Thank you. Rebecca walked toward the elevators carrying the sweatshirt against her chest like it belonged to her alone. Daniel watched her leave before finally speaking. Mom, she is stressed. I looked at my son for a long moment. His hair had gone grayer recently around the temples. George used to have the exact same streak at 41. I know she is stressed, I answered gently. That is not what hurts. Daniel looked down immediately. Silence stretched between us again. It had become our family's most common language. Years ago, Daniel used to call me every Sunday morning without fail. Sometimes just to ask how long to bake a pot roast. Sometimes to complain about work. Sometimes for no reason at all. Then Rebecca entered his life, and slowly the calls became shorter. Less frequent. Holidays became negotiations. Visits required advance notice. Ethan once spent entire summers at my house building forts in the backyard and helping George plant tomatoes beside the fence. After George passed away, those visits quietly disappeared too. At first Rebecca blamed school schedules, then sports, then family time. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. That was the clever part. None of the moments were dramatic enough to confront directly. They simply accumulated like dust settling across furniture until one day the whole room felt different. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. You should probably get some sleep tonight. His voice sounded careful now, almost nervous. I studied my son's face and realized something that made my chest ache more than anger ever could. He looked relieved whenever conflict stayed quiet, even if silence came at someone else's expense. Just like his father once warned me. I slipped my purse onto my shoulder and gave a small nod. Call me if Ethan wakes up asking for me, I said. Daniel opened his mouth as though he wanted to promise that he would. But no words came out. Rain followed me all the way home that night, streaking across the windshield in uneven lines while the windshield wipers dragged back and forth with a tired rhythm. The roads were mostly empty by then. A gas station near the interstate glowed against the darkness like a lonely lighthouse, and somewhere outside downtown a diner sign flickered red beside the highway. I drove slowly, both hands tight around the steering wheel, replaying every moment from the hospital over and over again. Rebecca's voice, Daniel's silence, the doctor calling my name instead of hers. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light had already switched itself on automatically. George installed that motion sensor years ago because he hated the idea of me walking up dark steps alone at night. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. White shutters, brick walkway, the maple tree near the mailbox already bare from November wind. But ever since George died, the inside never felt as warm once the sun went down. I stepped through the front door and paused automatically beside the umbrella stand where George used to leave his old baseball cap after mowing the lawn. Some habits survive grief longer than others. The kitchen clock read 11:47 p.m. The silence inside the house pressed against me immediately. No television humming in the din. No sound of George reading financial pages at the dining room table. Just the refrigerator motorcycling softly in the dark kitchen. I set my purse down carefully and removed my coat, hanging it beside George's old wool jacket that I still could not bring myself to move. People say grief softens with time. I think what really happens is that grief becomes furniture. You learn how to walk around it without bumping into the sharp corners every day. I filled the kettle with water and stood at the counter waiting for it to boil. My hand still felt cold from the hospital. Outside the kitchen window, rainwater slid slowly down the glass. I suddenly remembered Ethan at 6 years old sitting on this exact counter swinging his legs while George made pancakes shaped like baseballs every Sunday morning. Flour everywhere. Maple syrup spilled across the table. Daniel laughing from the living room while Rebecca checked work emails on her phone before church. Back then I used to think she simply preferred order over chaos. I told myself not everyone expressed warmth the same way. Looking back now, I realized Rebecca rarely joined moments she could not control. The kettle whistled softly. I poured hot water into a mug with fading blue flowers painted around the rim. George bought that mug for me during a trip to Vermont nearly 20 years ago because I once mentioned liking the color. He always listened carefully to small things. That was one of the reasons people trusted him. I carried the tea into the living room and sat beside the lamp near the fireplace. Family photographs lined the mantel in silver frames. Daniel graduating college. Ethan holding his first fish beside the lake cabin. One Christmas photo from years ago where Rebecca smiled brightly while resting a hand on Daniel's shoulder. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then another memory surfaced quietly from somewhere deep inside me. About 8 months after George's funeral, Ethan called me crying because he could not find the old compass his grandfather gave him. He was 11 then. Mom said Grandpa's stuff makes everybody sad, he whispered over the phone. She packed some things away. I drove over the next morning with homemade muffins and found George's belongings stacked inside garage boxes labeled storage. His fishing hat. Old journals. Framed military photos. Even the handmade birdhouse Ethan built with him one summer. Rebecca smiled politely when she opened the garage door. "We are simplifying," she explained. "Too much clutter can keep people stuck in the past." At the time I nodded because arguing seemed pointless. But now, sitting alone in the dim living room, another detail suddenly returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. George's locked filing cabinet had disappeared from Daniel's house shortly after that visit. I had asked Daniel where it went. He barely looked up from his phone when he answered. Rebecca donated some old office furniture. Donated. The word hit differently now. I set my untouched tea down slowly and looked toward the hallway leading to George's old study. A strange feeling settled over me then. Not panic. Not anger. Something quieter. Like the sound of a puzzle piece finally sliding into place after years of not knowing where it belonged. I sat in the living room for nearly an hour listening to the rain tap softly against the windows while memories kept rearranging themselves inside my head. It was strange how the truth sometimes arrived quietly instead of all at once. Not like lightning. More like dawn. Slow enough that you question what you were seeing at first. I finally stood and walked down the hallway toward George's study. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and old paper even after all these years. I had dusted everything regularly but changed almost nothing since his passing. His reading chair remained angled toward the bookshelf exactly the way he liked it. A pair of worn glasses still rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle on the side table. Most people probably would have called that unhealthy. Rebecca certainly would have. But grief does not move according to other people's schedules. I switched on the desk lamp, and warm amber light filled the room softly. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far in the distance. George's old oak desk sat beneath the window facing the backyard. I ran my fingers slowly across the smooth wood surface, remembering all the evenings he spent there balancing accounts, reviewing contracts, or writing notes in those yellow legal pads he always carried. George trusted paperwork more than promises. "People forget conversations," he used to tell Daniel. "Documents remember." At the time, Daniel would laugh and roll his eyes. But George never laughed when it came to protecting family. I lowered myself carefully into the desk chair and opened the top drawer. Pens. Stationery. old receipts neatly clipped together. Nothing unusual. The second drawer held tax folders organized by year. Everything labeled in George's precise handwriting. I almost stopped searching then because part of me still felt guilty digging through his things though I was looking for evidence against my own family. But then I remembered Rebecca standing in that hospital hallway guarding Ethan from me like I was dangerous. I remembered Daniel lowering his eyes instead of defending his mother. And beneath all of that, I remembered George warning me not to ignore what felt wrong simply to keep peace. My gaze drifted toward the bookshelf against the far wall. Something about it suddenly bothered me. I stood and walked closer. George arranged books obsessively by height and subject. History on the left, finance on the right, biographies in the center. But one section looked uneven now. I crouched slightly and noticed faint scratch marks near the bottom molding beside the shelf. My heartbeat slowed strangely. George once showed Ethan a hidden compartment behind that exact bookcase when he was 9 years old. They treated it like a secret mission for weeks afterward. I pressed gently against the side panel. First nothing happened. Then the shelf shifted inward with a quiet click. Behind it sat a narrow steel lockbox covered in dust. I stared at it for several seconds without moving. I had completely forgotten it existed. George must have hidden it years ago. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the box onto the desk. The key was not inside the study drawers. But George always believed people overcomplicated hiding places. The best secrets stay near ordinary things, he used to say. I opened the cabinet beside the fireplace where we stored board games and photo albums. Sure enough, taped beneath the old Monopoly box lid was a small brass key. My chest tightened painfully at the sight of his familiar carefulness. Even now, years after his death, it felt like George was still guiding me quietly through the dark. The lock clicked open. Inside rested several sealed folders, a flash drive, and one white envelope with my name written across the front in George's handwriting. Helen. Just that. Simple. Steady. I sat down slowly before opening it. The letter inside was dated 4 months before his death. My eyes moved carefully across the first lines. If you are reading this, it means something inside the family no longer feels right. I stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, rain hammered harder against the windows. George's words continued in the same calm voice I could hear perfectly inside my mind. Rebecca is more interested in control than connection. Daniel cannot see it clearly because avoiding conflict has always been his weakness. Pray I am wrong. But if I am not, you will need more than trust to protect yourself and Ethan. I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. The room suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Then my eyes landed on another folder inside the box labeled Medical Authorization and Family Trust Addendum. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, I realized George had not only seen the storm coming, he had prepared for it. I barely slept that night. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, but the house remained filled with the strange heaviness that comes after a storm passes through. I stayed in George's study until nearly 3 in the morning reading every document inside the lockbox one careful page at a time. Some papers were financial records connected to Ethan's future education trust. Others were copies of legal directives George had filed quietly through his attorney nearly a year before his diagnosis became serious. The deeper I read, the clearer his intentions became. George trusted Daniel's heart. But he did not trust Daniel's ability to stand up under pressure. And he trusted Rebecca even less. At 6:30, pale morning light crept through the study windows. I rubbed my tired eyes and stared at the final page resting on the desk in front of me. One paragraph had been underlined by George himself. In the event of familial interference impacting Ethan Whitmore's emotional or medical welfare, Helen Whitmore shall retain secondary oversight authority regarding trust disbursement and care coordination. I read the sentence 3 times. Not because I did not understand it, as I finally did. George knew exactly what Rebecca would eventually try to do. Control access. Control decisions. Control information. Not loudly. Quietly. Gradually. The same way she had been removing me from the family one careful step at a time for years. Closed the folder slowly and looked around the room. Dust floated through the thin strips of morning sunlight crossing the desk. George's chair sat empty beside the bookshelf. For the first time since his death, I no longer felt abandoned inside my grief. I felt accompanied. as though he had left a trail of lanterns behind for me to follow once the darkness became impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed softly against the desk, startling me. Daniel. I stared at his name for a second before answering. How is Ethan? I asked immediately. Daniel sounded exhausted. He is awake. Doctors want to keep him another day for monitoring. I closed my eyes briefly in relief. Can I see him? Silence. Not long, but long enough. Rebecca thinks too many visitors will stress him right now. The old version of me would have apologized for asking. I would have swallowed the hurt quietly just to avoid creating tension. But something had shifted during the night. Daniel, I said calmly, I am family, not a visitor. Another silence followed. I could hear muffled hospital noises behind his breathing. Elevator chimes. Footsteps. Someone speaking over an intercom. Mom, he said carefully, can we just not do this today? That sentence settled over me colder than anger ever could, because Daniel still thought the problem was discomfort, not exclusion, not manipulation, not the fact that his mother had been treated like a stranger beside her own grandson. I will be there in an hour, I replied softly before ending the call. I dressed slowly that morning. Gray wool coat, blue sweater, low heels practical enough for hospital floors. Small ordinary choices that somehow made me feel steadier. Before leaving, I returned the documents to the lockbox except for 2 folders and the flash drive. Those I placed carefully inside my leather tote bag. George always believed preparation mattered more than emotion. Outside, the neighborhood looked washed clean after the storm. Fallen leaves clung to curbs still damp from rainwater. A school bus stopped 3 houses down while sleepy children climbed aboard carrying oversized backpacks. Life continued normally everywhere else while mine quietly rearranged itself. During the drive downtown, I passed the diner where George and I used to eat breakfast every Sunday after church. Same faded blue sign. Same cracked parking lot. I almost pulled in out of habit before remembering there would only be 1 coffee cup waiting at the booth now. The hospital parking garage smelled faintly of wet concrete when I stepped out of the elevator. Inside the lobby, volunteers arranged fresh flowers near the information desk, while families moved quietly between waiting rooms carrying paper coffee cups and overnight bags. Everything looked exactly the same as the night before, but I did not feel the same walking through it. When I reached Ethan's floor, I immediately spotted Rebecca standing near the nurse's station speaking in hushed tones with a woman wearing a beige business suit and hospital identification badge. The moment Rebecca saw me, her entire posture stiffened. The woman beside her glanced in my direction politely. Then Rebecca said something quickly under her breath. The woman's expression changed almost instantly. Not hostile, careful, controlled, like someone who had just realized there was more happening inside this family than she had originally been told. Rebecca excused herself from the woman in the beige suit the second I approached the nurse's station. Her smile appeared instantly, polished and controlled, but I noticed the tension around her eyes. Helen, she said softly, as though we were simply 2 tired family members trying to get through a difficult morning together. You came early. I wanted to see Ethan. My voice remained calm. Rebecca folded her arms lightly across her coat. He is resting. Behind her, the woman with the hospital badge offered me a polite nod. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. I am Angela Pierce from Patient Services. Good morning. Angela studied me carefully for a moment before glancing between Rebecca and me. There are some authorization details we are reviewing regarding Ethan's file. Rebecca gave a quick laugh that sounded too rehearsed to be natural. It is just outdated paperwork from years ago, she explained smoothly. George had a habit of overcomplicating things. The moment she mentioned George, something inside me sharpened. Not anger. Clarity. George had not overcomplicated anything. He had prepared for exactly this moment. I reached into my tote bag and removed the folder marked medical authorization. Rebecca's smile faded almost immediately. I brought copies, I said quietly. Angela's posture straightened slightly. Would you mind stepping into the conference room with me? Rebecca opened her mouth before quickly stopping herself. For the first time since I arrived, she looked uncertain. Daniel appeared at the end of the hallway carrying 2 paper coffee cups. He slowed the moment he saw us standing together. His tired eyes moved from the folder in my hands to Rebecca's expression. "What is going on?" he asked cautiously. Nobody answered right away. The silence itself seemed to make Daniel uneasy. Angela finally gestured politely toward a small room near the nurse's station. "Perhaps we should all sit down for a moment." The conference room smelled faintly like printer toner and stale coffee. A long table stretched beneath harsh fluorescent lights while rain clouds darkened the windows overlooking the parking garage outside. Daniel sat beside Rebecca. I sat across from them. Angela opened the folder carefully and adjusted her glasses while reading through the documents. The only sound in the room came from the faint hum of ventilation overhead. Rebecca tapped one manicured fingernail softly against the table. Small. Repetitive. Nervous. Daniel leaned forward after nearly a full minute of silence. "Mom," he said carefully, "what exactly is this?" I looked at my son for a moment before answering. "Something your father prepared before he passed away." Rebecca shifted immediately. "George trusted us completely," she said quickly. "I do not understand why we are suddenly acting like there is some kind of legal problem." Angela looked up from the paperwork then. "Mrs. Whitmore, according to these documents, Helen Whitmore holds secondary oversight authority involving Ethan's medical coordination and trust protections under specific conditions." Rebecca blinked once. Slowly. "What conditions?" Angela hesitated briefly, before answering in a professional tone. "Familial conflict impacting care decisions." The room went completely still. Daniel frowned. "What does that even mean?" Angela folded her hands carefully. "It means Mr. Whitmore anticipated possible disputes involving Ethan's welfare and established safeguards." Rebecca let out a short breath through her nose, almost amused. "Safeguards," she repeated quietly. "This is ridiculous." But her voice no longer sounded confident. I watched her carefully. For years Rebecca always controlled conversations by staying composed while everyone else became emotional. But now tiny cracks were beginning to appear. Her shoulders felt tighter. Her breathing quicker. George used to say the most dangerous people panic the fastest when control slips away unexpectedly. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Why would Dad do this?" he asked softly, more to himself than anyone else. I could hear genuine confusion in his voice now. Maybe even hurt. Angela slid another page across the table toward him. "There is also a financial protection clause connected to Ethan's educational trust." Rebecca's head turned sharply. Too sharply. She noticed her mistake immediately and forced herself to lean back again. But I saw it. So did Angela. Daniel looked down at the document. "Financial protection?" Angela nodded. "Any attempt to isolate designated family oversight or alter approved care coordination can temporarily freeze discretionary trust distributions until legal review is completed." Rebecca's face lost color for half a second before she looked toward me again. Not with anger this time. Calculation. Like she was suddenly trying to determine how much I knew. And in that moment, sitting beneath those cold fluorescent lights while hospital staff moved quietly beyond the conference room door, I realized something deeply unsettling. Rebecca had never expected me to stop being passive. Daniel kept staring at the papers in front of him long after Angela stopped speaking. He looked like someone trying to recognize a familiar road after realizing he had been driving in the wrong direction for years. Rebecca sat perfectly still beside him now, both hands folded. Tightly in her lap. Too tightly. The polished confidence she usually carried so effortlessly had begun slipping in small invisible pieces. "This cannot be right," she finally said quietly. "George never discussed any of this with us." Angela maintained the same professional tone. "The documents were legally filed and updated through Mr. Whitmore's attorney, approximately 4 months before his passing." Daniel slowly looked up at me. "You knew about this?" His voice carried something fragile inside it now. Not accusation exactly. More like disappointment searching for somewhere to land. I shook my head softly. "Not until last night." Rebecca gave a short disbelieving laugh. "Convenient timing." I met her eyes calmly. "The hospital contacted me because your actions triggered the review process." That landed harder than I expected. Rebecca's expression tightened immediately. "My actions?" Angela carefully cleared her throat before the conversation could escalate. Mrs. Whitmore, the issue is not personal disagreement. The concern involves restricted communication and inconsistent authorization requests submitted overnight. Daniel frowned. What requests? Rebecca turned toward him quickly. I was trying to simplify things because everyone was emotional. But Angela opened another page from the file. There was also an inquiry regarding early access to portions of Ethan's educational trust under emergency family hardship provisions. Silence. Heavy this time. Daniel blinked slowly. What? Rebecca straightened in her chair. That is not unusual. We have medical bills now. Rebecca, Daniel said carefully, you told me insurance covered almost everything. Most things, she corrected quickly. But we still need flexibility. I watched Daniel's face change little by little while pieces began fitting together inside his mind. The expensive kitchen renovation Rebecca insisted they needed last spring. The new luxury SUV despite Daniel wanting something modest. The constant pressure to move Ethan into a private sports academy that costs more than some colleges. George noticed it all long before I did. Not greed in obvious ways. Entitlement disguised as ambition. Rebecca leaned forward suddenly, her voice softer now. Daniel, your father always treated me like an outsider. You know that. It was a clever move. Redirect emotion. Shift sympathy. Rebecca had spent years mastering the art of sounding wounded whenever accountability approached too closely. But something was different now. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept looking down at the paperwork in front of him. Dad trusted Mom with this, he said quietly. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Your father trusted control. The words slipped out too fast. Too sharp. Even she realized it immediately afterward. Angela glanced down awkwardly at the table. I remained still. George used to tell me the truth rarely arrives dramatically. Usually it escapes through tiny cracks people fail to guard during pressure. The conference room door suddenly opened before anyone could speak again. A nurse stepped halfway inside. Ethan is asking for his grandmother. The room went silent. Rebecca looked toward the nurse first. I am his mother. I know, the nurse said gently. But he specifically asked for Mrs. Whitmore. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Daniel stood immediately, almost relieved to move. I will get him settled. But the nurse shook her head softly. He asked for her alone. Rebecca's face changed completely then. Not anger. Fear. Real fear for the first time since this all began. Because control depends heavily on isolation. And Ethan had just broken it himself. Daniel looked toward me slowly. His eyes seemed older this morning somehow. Mom, he said quietly, will you go see him? I nodded once and rose from the table. Rebecca stood too fast beside me. He is emotional right now. He probably does not even understand what he is saying. I turned toward her calmly. Children usually understand more than adults think. For a second neither of us moved. Then Rebecca stepped aside. Barely. But enough. The hallway outside felt strangely quiet after the tension inside the conference room. Nurses moved between rooms carrying charts while sunlight finally pushed weakly through the clouds beyond the windows. As I walked toward Ethan's room, I noticed my hands were steady now. Completely steady. The closer I got, the more memories returned all at once. Ethan asleep on my shoulder during fireworks when he was 4. Ethan proudly handing George crooked tomatoes from the garden at 7. Ethan crying after George's funeral because nobody else remembered Grandpa cut sandwiches into triangles for him. Love leaves patterns behind, even when people try to interrupt them. I stopped outside Ethan's hospital room and gently pushed the door open. He looked small against the white pillows and pale blue blankets, but the moment he saw me, relief softened his entire face. Grandma, he whispered. And hearing that word spoken without fear felt like sunlight finally reaching a room that had been dark for years. Ethan looked exhausted, but when I walked into the room, some of the tension left his face immediately. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the half-closed blinds beside his bed, painting pale lines across the blanket covering his legs. Machines beeped quietly nearby while a cartoon played silently on the television mounted high in the corner. Hospitals always try to make children feel less afraid with bright walls and cheerful decorations, but fear still lingers there anyway. Ethan reached for my hand the second I sat beside him. His fingers felt warm now instead of cold like the night before. "Dad said you almost went home," he whispered. I smiled gently. "I changed my mind." He looked down at the blanket for a moment before speaking again. "Mom gets upset when I talk about Grandpa." The words came out carefully, like he had been holding them inside for a long time. I kept my voice soft. "Why do you think that is?" Ethan shrugged weakly. "She says people need to move on." Move on. Such simple words for something impossible. I brushed my thumb lightly across the back of his hand. "Your grandfather loved you very much." Ethan nodded immediately. "I know." There was no hesitation in his answer. Children always know who truly showed up for them. Outside the room, muted voices drifted through the hallway. I recognized Daniel's voice almost immediately, lower and more strained than usual. Rebecca answered sharply, though I could not make out the words themselves. Ethan heard it too. His shoulders tensed slightly beneath the blanket. "Are they fighting?" he asked quietly. "Adults are talking," I answered carefully. He looked unconvinced but did not press further. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the window. "Grandpa used to say storms pass faster if you stop staring at them." A soft laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "That sounds exactly like him." Ethan smiled faintly for the first time since I entered the room. The door opened gently a few minutes later, and Daniel stepped inside alone. He looked exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. His tie hung loose around his collar, and faint shadows rested beneath his eyes. Ethan brightened slightly when he saw him. "Hey, buddy." Daniel forced a tired smile and walked over to adjust Ethan's blanket. Then his gaze shifted toward me. Something inside his expression had changed. The defensiveness from earlier seemed gone now, replaced by something quieter. Shame perhaps. Regret. "Can I speak with Mom for a minute?" he asked softly. Ethan nodded and reached for the remote control beside the bed while Daniel and I stepped into the hallway. Rebecca was nowhere in sight. For a second neither of us spoke. Hospital staff moved around us carrying clipboards and medication trays while sunlight slowly brightened the corridor windows. Finally Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "I did not see it," he admitted quietly. "Or maybe I just did not want to." I remained silent. Daniel looked down at the floor. "After Dad died, everything became easier if I stayed out of conflict. Rebecca always said she was protecting our family from drama." He gave a hollow laugh without humor. I think I started confusing peace with avoidance. The honesty in his voice hurt more than excuses would have. Because deep down I knew Daniel was telling the truth. Weakness inside families rarely arrives through cruelty alone. Sometimes it arrives through silence. "Your father loved you very much," I said gently. "He just worried you would spend too much of your life trying to keep everyone comfortable." Daniel's eyes grew wet immediately, though he looked away before tears could fully form. "I should have defended you yesterday." I studied my son for a long moment. The same boy who once cried for an hour after accidentally hitting a bird with his bicycle. The same teenager who used to carry my grocery bags inside without being asked. People do not become strangers overnight. Sometimes they simply drift too far from themselves without noticing. "Then start now," I said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Slow. Serious. Down the hallway, Rebecca finally appeared near the elevators holding her phone tightly against her chest. She stopped the moment she saw us standing together outside Ethan's room. Her face remained composed, but the distance between us had changed now. Control weakens quickly once truth enters the room. Several weeks later, after Ethan returned home safely, Sunday mornings slowly began returning to something familiar again. Not perfect. Never perfect. But honest. Daniel started bringing Ethan over for breakfast every weekend while legal reviews quietly sorted through the trust protections George had established years before. Rebecca rarely came inside anymore. Eventually she stopped coming at all. One cold December morning, Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen counter eating pancakes while snow drifted softly outside the windows. Daniel stood silently near the coffee maker watching us with tired but clearer eyes. The house no longer felt empty in the same way it once had. Before taking another bite, Ethan reached across the counter and squeezed my hand gently. Such a small gesture. But after everything it felt larger than words. And sometimes I still think back to that hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights, the silence, the sound of my daughter-in-law trying to push me out of my own family. But George had been right all along. Documents remember. Children remember. And eventually so do the people who stayed silent for too long.